Thank you for joining on a bit of a grisly day. I don't know how it is in your neck of the woods, but I must be getting old because I just think that my garden needs some rain. So yeah, sign of getting old, not least. And then my son doing GCSEs, very scary. Anyway, that is not what today is about. Today is about client listening and, in particular, client listening culture. And a number of you online know who I am and will know how I approach client listening. Some of you don't know, so I am going to spend not a few minutes, a few seconds, just introducing who I am, and it's kind of important for this session, which is why I'm going to do it. Because for me, client listening is a bit of a kind of a baby, a product of my weird squiggly career. And it's where my weird squiggly career comes together in a really nice way. So I want to share that with you because it will hopefully inform what I'm going to talk about for the next hour, which is going to be slightly different perhaps from other sessions that you've been on around client listening. And there are a number of us on the line. I'm not going to be able to focus on the chat and you. So if you want to heckle me, if you want to interrupt, if you want to ask a question, please just take yourself off mute and ask. It's much more interesting when there's a conversation going. So despite the fact I have slides, despite the fact I have a flow, please just heckle me or put your electronic hand up, and hopefully someone online will say, Claire, you're forgetting that someone's got their hand up. So let's make this kind of as interactive as we can do. So what is my weird career and how does it come together? So I started off life as a solicitor, but please don't hold that against me. I jumped ship really early on, but I was kind of on the professionals side of the fence. So I have a bit of an understanding of what it feels like to receive feedback and what might be getting in the way. I've also, in the bulk of my career, really has been business development roles, and I've always felt when I was in the shoes of many of you that listening to clients is the most powerful thing that you can do. I think all too often professional services firms, I'm going to mention law firms a lot because that's my background, but professional services firms, law firms in particular, are really good at kind of build it and they will come without kind of testing and going out and asking.
And they feel like little mini cities.
Oh, someone's
Right, so that's where I'm going to go now.
Right,
But,
okay.
yeah,
hang on.
yeah, see you in a bit.
Who we can hear in the background. If I can work out how to do it. There we are. Suzanne, I think you've also got the power to mute people for me. Thank you. So yeah, business development roles, client listening for me has always been the thing which for me is a really easy thing to do because it's just having a conversation and it's really powerful. And that's my starting point with client listening. But the other hat that I wear and that's important for the session today is I'm a coach. So I'm a one-to-one coach and a team coach. And the way that I approach coaching is quite systemic. So I like to look at the big picture, the context in which the individual, the team, or the firm play. And that's really what I'm going to share with you today on this session around client listening. So what I want to share today is the following. And hopefully this aligns with the invite that you all received and what you are hoping to get from today. And what I want to do is I want to think a little bit about culture, because I think culture is one of these buzzwords that we hear quite a lot. We don't necessarily think about it a lot. We've all heard the saying culture eats strategy for breakfast, and it's always something that interests people. But what I want to do is I want to dig a bit deeper around this idea of culture. What is it, and why on earth am I talking about it in the context of client listening, and why, if you are involved in client listening, you should be interested in this kind of particular topic. I want to talk about the signs. So how might you know you've got a culture that's open to listening or not? And I also want to cover the so what. So hopefully the first bit of the session will be interesting. I find it interesting and fascinating, but so what? So I want to give some thoughts and some ideas around how you might overcome some barriers if you've got barriers, and how you can foster an environment where not only do you kind of embrace listening, but you also act on it, because I don't think there's anything worse than going and asking clients what they want, hearing what they want, and then not doing anything about it. So That's the plan. Please do interrupt me. There are certain points in across the session where I will stop and pause for breath and ask what you think. But if anything arises, do ask me, because it will make it much more interesting for everyone, and yourselves included. So I guess to start off with, and let's use the chat button initially, but if anyone doesn't want to type and wants to just ask me, then you can say, what comes up for you when you hear this kind of word, culture? What do you think? What does it mean for you?
Behavior.
Behavior, yeah. Being engaged, yeah. Ethos,
Common purpose.
purpose, yeah. Being part of a team. And the way we do things around here, yeah. So keep those coming, because it'll be interesting for me, and I will kind of dip in and look at them. And I think that, Paul, you've probably heard me talk about culture before. I think often when we hear this thing culture, we think about behaviour and we think about the way we do things around here. When it comes to professional services firms, I often talk about who does things around here, because I think actually the two kind of go hand in hand when you're looking at professional services firms. As an aside, one of the things that I'm passionate about is leadership and getting a more balanced representation in leadership, and I've done a lot of work around culture and who does things around here. But what I want to do is I want to share two models of culture. There are hundreds, so I'm not going to bore you with hundreds. I'm going to share two, which I think are quite interesting, tie it all together, and we can start to explore them in the context of client listening. So the first model that I want to share is quite an old model. It's by an anthropologist, and many of you who know me know I'm a bit of a magpie, so I steal from all different types of isms. Edward T. Hall created a model of culture which he called the cultural iceberg. And the reason I'm sharing this is about macro cultures. So we're talking about nations, we're talking about culture in kind of the widest sense. But why this is interesting is for two reasons. One, it ties really neatly into the model of organisational culture that I'm going to share in a moment. It also ties in really nicely with what I do when I coach. So when you coach, if any of you have experienced coaching, it's about tapping into your unconscious, and it's about surfacing things that you may not be aware of. And this particular model of culture nods to the fact that there are things that we can see and there are things that we can't see. This is at a macro level, so you can kind of start to see some of the things up there. I won't read through. The other thing that's interesting about this model, and again, I'm going to leave it here because I think it all does trickle down, is that there's more underneath the water than there is on top, as is the case with icebergs. And what the cultural iceberg model suggests is that the things that are hidden are most effectively hidden from their own participants. So you are even less likely to notice what's going on when you're part of it. So there's some really horrible, I say horrible, it's the one that's in my mind, so I'll share it, but it's the idea that the frog doesn't notice the water's boiling. It's, you kind of can't see what's in front of you. There's lots of stuff around that, around bias. So the two things I want you to take from this slide is when we talk about culture, there are things that we can see and there are things that we can't see. And the things that we can't see are hidden to those on the outside, but they're also hidden to those on the inside. And I think that's quite important to kind of note. I have speaking notes because I always end up going off piece, and actually I will share it because it was interesting. So I'm going to do a little quiz. We're going to use the chat again to make sure that it's not just me talking and engaging all of you. And it's a puzzle, a riddle, and I want you to answer in the way that's right for you. And it is, if you are on a boat and you're on the boat with your mother, your child, assuming you have children, and your partner, who would you save? So would you save, and you can only save one. It's not, oh, well, I'd try and save all of them, or I'd save my mum because she can hold up the, if you could only save one, would you save your mother, your partner, or your child? And it doesn't make you a bad person if you choose one over the other. So almost everyone there putting in child, which is really interesting. So I came across, well, I've got that problem as well, Fiona, I've got 4 children. I came across this in a DEI session that I was in recently, and the lady who was also talking about culture at Macro Sense said that what is interesting is that the answer, if there is kind of a right answer, is if you come from a Western culture, you always save the child, or the responses show that most people would save their child for various reasons. It seems natural. My mum's had a good long life, my partner, whatever, he or she has been around for a while. If you come from an Eastern culture, the predominant answer is mother, because that's just the way that the culture is. So it's really interesting, isn't it? Yeah, I mean, there are layers to this. Some people might not have children, but assuming you have all 3, if you come from the West, you tend to answer child, and if you come from the East, you tend to answer mother, which is really interesting because it just again shows this what goes on under the surface. The reasons that drive our decisions are not necessarily reasons that we notice or we realise. So, what does all of this have to do with firms, and what does this all have to do with client listening? So there is another model of culture, and this is an organizational culture model that I want to share, and it's an easy model. So for those that know me, I like to go with easy models because they're easier to remember. And also Edgar Sheen, whose model it is, has written a lovely book called Humble Inquiry. So if anyone's interested in the art of active listening, the art of asking questions, Humble Inquiry is a really good book that I would recommend. So 2 reasons why I've chosen this model. And Edgar Sheen describes culture, and he notes again that there are hundreds of different types of definitions of culture, but he describes it as a learnt phenomena. So it is something that a group has learnt over time, and it comes about because of the way that a group has learnt to deal with problems or face opportunities. And because it's worked well, it becomes embedded and it becomes repeated, and it's what people then teach to those that come in. So he sees it very much as learning and as something that therefore sort of becomes fixed in the DNA of a place. And interestingly, not just about how we do things, not just about behaviour, but about all sorts of other things. So how we talk, how we perceive, how we think. And it can have all of that can have a profound impact on behaviour. So this is the model, and if my things work, there are 3 layers, and the different colouring is kind of a nod to the model that's just gone before, which is that there are elements of culture that we can see, and then there are elements of culture that we can't see. And at the top here, we have what Edgar Sheen describes as artifacts. So they are things that we can see, but they're not necessarily easy to decipher. So again, I'm going to go macro and then I'm going to go into client listening. Things like technology, things like how do people show up? Do they wear suits? Do they not? What sort of language is used in the office? What are the myths and stories that are told about the group or the firm? That for me is particularly interesting. So as I said, I started off life as a solicitor. I started off at Herbert Smith, and it was quite interesting that before I embarked on, where do I go and practice, there were lots of stories that were told about different firms, and this firm is this and that firm is that. So that for me is particularly interesting. What does it feel like to be part of this group, part of this firm? So that's kind of at the top level. The next level of culture is beliefs and values, and I think someone kind of picked up on that when I asked about what do you think about when you think about culture. And this is really, why do we do what we do? So they are things that are conscious, so we notice them, they're articulated, and there are things, when you think about an organisation, it might be a value statement, it might be this is our aspiration, it might be written in your strategy, it might be your ideology, interesting with B Corp, you know, probably lots of this is kind of put out there for people to read and to see. And that tends to be where people start and stop with culture, because that's the stuff that's above the line. It's the things that we can either notice and observe, or the things that we say. What is interesting, and where we're going to spend a little bit of time on the talk today, is around the underlying assumptions. And these are the things that are unconscious. So it's the stuff that we need to work on to surface, that we take for granted, and that provide the identity and the self-esteem of the group. So to give you an example of how this might work in a culture. So I've said it's a learnt behaviour, or a learnt thing, this idea of culture, and it can drive down and create and embed itself in the DNA of an organization. So I think most people online will be working in kind of BD, marketing, client listening roles. So I know professional services don't like to talk about sales, but let's use the word sales. I don't mind using the word sales. So let's say we're in an organization and sales have gone down, and someone comes in and says, I think what we need to do is advertising, because advertising is the way that you boost sales. So that's something to be tested. The person manages to get the sign off. They do a lot of advertising, and lo and behold, people phone up and sales go up. So once that's learnt, so they've tried something out, it worked, there was a problem, the result was that the sales went up. So if they repeat that, part of that culture of that organization will then be based on an assumption: advertising is good, advertising works. And that kind of becomes embedded, and isn't necessarily something that people will talk about, but it becomes kind of fixed. So what does all of this have to do with client listening? I'm conscious that I'm throwing lots at you. So if people do have questions, or I'm going too quickly, do shout. But what I tend to do on these things is I tend to rattle through a few slides and then I'll pause. So that is the idea for after this slide. So how does all of this work, and why am I talking about it in the context of client listening? And I guess before I share this and think about this in the context of client listening, what's really interesting as someone, and I'm going to lean back to where I started, that it's often difficult to see something when you're in it. And what is interesting as an external who goes and talks to different firms about client listening, whether it's doing listening or whether it's different ways of kind of working with firms on client listening, I can see difference across firms, which for me is quite clear, just because I'm working with a number of firms, where if I were in a firm, it would probably really be something that I wouldn't necessarily notice. And there are certain things that get in the way of client listening programs, which to me point towards culture. And they are things like how easy it is to get names on a list. It is around how easy is it to feed back information into the business. It's about how transparent organisations are when they get feedback. Do we just control it and give it to the client team? Is it open for everyone to see? So there are certain things which for me really point in the direction of culture. And the layer on top of that is I do a lot of work with firms with my coaching hat on rather than my client listening hat on around feedback. And often when I do one-to-one coaching, I'll get, or this place isn't very good at feedback, or I've been sent because I need to be more confident, or I need more gravitas, or I can list and reel off all the different reasons why people have come for coaching because they've been given some feedback that hasn't landed well. And actually it all, for me as an external, points towards actually this culture isn't very good at giving feedback. So using this model in the context of client listening, I'm going to give an example, and what we'll do is we'll pause, and you might have some questions, you might have some thoughts, and then we'll kind of move on to some more slides. So how might this work in the context of client listening? At the top level, we've said we've got the artifacts. So these are the things that we can see, that we can point to. We can't necessarily decipher what sits behind them, but they exist. So in the context of client listening, it might be we have a client listening program. It might be we send out a survey. It might be, there are many things that I think you can probably think of in terms of visible at the top connection to client listening. And what is interesting when we work with firms who are just starting off, this tends to be where people jump in. So, oh, we need to send a survey. Oh, we need to do some interviews, you know, whatever it might be. This is where people tend to jump in. But sitting underneath that, there are likely to be some values and some statements that exist in the context of listening. And they can be things like, we're client-centric, we're trusted advisors, we partner with our clients. I mean, if you go onto law firm websites, you possibly have some of these on there. We value client input. Great. All of that sits underneath and is the reason why we've decided to send a survey. It's the reason why we've decided to have a client listening program. But crucially, and this is where things get interesting, and actually I'm going to share 2 slides before we go to a conversation, because hopefully that will cement this a bit more and make the conversation more interesting. We might have some assumptions that sit underneath that might actually mean that what we've got above the water isn't quite as client-centric as we might think. So there could be assumptions like, and actually I've heard some of these sometimes in the room, there could be assumptions around, well, clients will exaggerate, well, clients are only going to tell us the bad stuff if we phone them up. You know, you can think about a number of different things that might be going on there. There might be an assumption that feedback is painful, and there are a number of examples that I can share in that regard around just feedback generally, and how that, you know, how people react to feedback can go back quite a long way in terms of childhood, in terms of parenting, in terms of all different sorts of things. It might be that you're in an organisation where you can't challenge authority, so there might be an assumption of, oh, well, we don't challenge those who bring in the money, or we don't challenge partners if we're not a fee earner, or, you know, you can imagine again a number here. And there can be other assumptions like, well, if there was a problem, our clients would tell us. Now, some of these assumptions are under the line. Some of these you might actually hear. So, you know, again, something for you to think about. I'm going to share, again, kind of an extension of this in terms of what I see as an outsider, and then we can kind of pause and have a bit of a conversation, because hopefully something is landed that you're kind of thinking, oh, that's interesting. I'd like to unpick that a bit more. So, in thinking about culture and in working with firms, the way that I've sort of put it in my mind is there's a spectrum, because there's always a spectrum with these things, and we tend to be on a spectrum always. And there's always a start and an end point to a spectrum. And at one end, you've got a culture that's very, very closed, and at the other end, you've got a culture that's very, very open. And when we talk about client listening culture, for me, there's a real tie across into feedback culture. How do we embrace feedback as a firm? And that is not only external feedback, but internal feedback, because the two kind of depend on each other. Because actually, the best client listening programs get the insights from the clients, and then they're fed back to the individual. So there's always an element of internal feedback. So at one level, at this visible level, you could have a closed culture where you don't do anything, basically. You know, we know what we need to know. The clients are happy. They tell us if there was a problem. Versus kind of, in fact, I'm going to go to the open and then I'll read the middle. You can, spoiler alert, you can read the middle if you want to. I guess the other end of the spectrum is, you know, what can we learn? Who can we ask? You know, every client is fair game. You can go to whoever you like, crack on. And it's not only just ad hoc, it's all the time. So there for me are the two ends of the spectrum. The reality is, I suspect most firms I come across are somewhere in the middle. So yeah, I like the idea of client listening, but not with my clients. Okay, we can do this, but actually we need to be careful about who we ask, and we need to be mindful. We can't just go out to anybody. Might be ad hoc, so once or twice a year. For some firms, that might mean, yes, we can do it, but actually we need a partner in the room, or we need the partners to be leading the feedback. That could include, actually, yeah, we can do it, but we don't want someone from outside. Under the radar, because all of that, hopefully some of you will resonate with and can possibly think about, where am I on this spectrum? Under the radar, which, as I said, is harder to notice when you're inside, but something that I sort of start to notice because I'm curious, and is something I see when I work on a team coaching basis. You know, on the closed perspective, assumptions around, and as I said, these are unconscious, these are below the water, but people assuming, well, we shouldn't really question partners. Feedback is criticism and a sign of failure. That's something I see a lot, particularly when I work one-to-one or when I work particularly around feedback generally. Speaking up is risky. Silence is valued over truth. So there are a number of things there. A lot of this ties into psychological safety, which is where I'm going to go in a moment. On the other side, on the open side, I made my fly-ins work this time. You know, mistakes are an opportunity to learn. Everyone's got someone to contribute. Status doesn't matter. Vulnerability is a strength. I've been in a lot of professional services firms. I'm not sure I've been in any that are really kind of hitting that end of the spectrum. In the middle, things like, yeah, feedback's useful, but might be uncomfortable. It's safer to give feedback if it's been invited, or it's framed diplomatically. Trust and relationships matter. So you can start to see how this really simple structure can be really complex, because often the devil's in the detail with everything, but how you can start to see that actually, depending on where you're focusing, sometimes the brick walls that we hit up against when we think about client listening, you know, aren't in, oh, well, we need a better system, oh, we need to send more surveys, oh, we need to do it a bit more regularly. Actually, it's a bit deeper than that, and actually some of the problems that firms come up against are ones that need to be thought about in a different way, because you can throw all of the artifacts you like, if what's going on is underneath the water, it's going to be quite hard to make a shift. So I've spoken for way longer than I like to. I'm going to take a glass of water, but I'd like to invite you, thoughts, reflections, questions.
I think that the theory is absolutely spot on and absolutely right. I think the more interesting discussion is how you change it and what you do about it, because actually fundamentally that's, you know, firms are absolutely have an underriding culture and you know, hear all of these things all of the time. I'm very lucky that I come from a firm that is very much on the open end of this.
Mm-hmm.
But that has taken 5-6 years of really hard work to get there. And that has been a massive cultural shift within the firm. But unless you've got the people at the top of the tree who are going to ride that wave with you and make that cultural shift, you'll never make it.
Yeah, and the so what is absolutely okay. This is great and interesting, but what do we do? So I'm going to go there, but I'm going to pick up on two of the things you've said. One is leadership buy-in. You know, spoiler alert, absolutely crucial. And I'm going to talk about leadership in the context of psychological safety, where I think it's particularly important. And you know, it's interesting to hear kind of 5-6 years. This is not something that you can just, you know, is all fixed. It is something that's gradual, because if you think about where it's come from, it's been embedded and it's there, and it's not something that you can just sort of wave a magic wand and change. So thank you. Anyone else got any questions or thoughts? Mine's thrown a lot.
I'm just going to say, Claire, that I feel like my firm is open, but then when you're looking at it, I'm starting to realise maybe that they're not so open. And then within that, you have the groups or the divisions, who I find there's one group that is very closed, one that private client are very open and they're happy to do it, and then you have like a midpoint where they say they're going to do it and then they don't. So it's almost like I've got 3 of the cultures all in one, and but overarching it seems to be open. So yeah, that's quite a challenge, I think, having 3 cultures in the different divisions that we've got.
Yeah, and I think, and I'm going to share a bit on psychological safety, because I think that's quite interesting to tie things together, because I think a lot of, you know, there's loads of research around the impact that a direct leader has on its team. So it's unsurprising, particularly in professional services firms, where you tend to work with, you know, a partner, a couple of partners, and you tend to be quite siloed. Even if you're a firm that isn't particularly siloed, the nature of the work is such that you tend to be siloed and work in teams. That's not uncommon. And I'm looking at Suzanne because Suzanne and I used to work together in 2 firms actually, so Big Anna Regional, and yeah, I mean there were definitely teams with which you could challenge, you could ask, you could learn, and teams that was, you know, and individuals within teams where that was really not going to happen. And you know, I think most people who work in professional services firms know that you start where the door is open and you use that to be able to try and make shifts. And the interesting thing there comes with when you're starting a program, great, you can start with all the open doors, but actually for a program to work, all doors need to be open. And that's where you then really need to start doing some kind of interesting work to shift along. So I'm going to share a bit about psychological safety. Again, if there are any kind of quick thoughts, and then the so what, which hopefully will be the interesting bit, and we can kind of go a bit deeper and talk about that. People have got questions as we go through, just throw them into the chat because I will pick them up at some point. And if you're anything like me, if I don't ask the question when I've got it in my mind, it slips away. So please do use the chat. So I'm going to share these slides, and I'm just going to skip over them because I'm going to share the slides with you. But you might be thinking, I wonder whereabouts I am on this journey. And I'll share the slides. There are some questions that you can ask of your firm and have a think about. And you can have a think about where you might score and what that might mean in terms of your listening approach. And it's interesting because, as I said, I've worked with and in multiple different firms, and I've also worked increasingly with non-professional services firms. And it's quite interesting being in an organisation which is really at this kind of open end, where almost, you know, every day is a what can we learn, what have we learned, what's gone wrong, how can we improve, and actively seeking out, you know, what failures have we and how can we shift the dial. It's a completely different way of doing things. And it's a completely different way of doing things, and it's notable for me when I work with teams from, you know, kind of non-professional services, the difference when you just walk in the door. So, psychological safety. I'm going to talk a bit about psychological safety because it's quite relevant to feedback generally, it's relevant to the cultural piece, and it's relevant to the shift, because actually when we talk about the so what and how do we move things forward, this is a really good place to start. So, psychological safety, let's go quickly just to kind of get some more voices in the room. Again, use the chat or come off chat if you'd prefer, but what do you understand by the term psychological safety?
Can I be really brutal?
Yeah.
I just think it's theoretical stuff that's a good excuse for people being able to say no. I honestly, do you know what? Psychological safety 4 years ago wasn't even a thing, but you know, it's now got a name and everybody talks about it, but the underlying issues are still the same.
Okay. Comfortable to challenge, safe to express thoughts. Anyone else? To be honest, without fear of punishment. And it's absolutely fine if people want to come off mute, and it's absolutely fine to challenge. I'm happy to be challenged. Feel safe even when criticised. Yeah. So I think, and it's interesting that psychological safety is one of those things that is a bit of a buzzword. And it's interesting because one of the other things that I often talk about is growth mindset. And that's another one that's become a bit of a, we have, everyone around here has a growth mindset. Everyone here, you know, we have psychological safety. But the reason I want to share it is because it is, I believe it's important for teams, it's important for high performing teams, and there's loads and loads of research to show why and how it improves things. And it's really important in the context of feedback, which is why I'm sharing it now. So this is the definition, which comes from Amy Edmondson. For those who are interested in psychological safety, Amy Edmondson is the lady who kind of is credited with coining the term, responsible for the term for those who don't like it. And the way that she defines it is a shared belief held by members of a team that the team is safe for interpersonal risk taking. And I've going to kind of define it in terms of what it is and what it isn't, because I think there is sometimes some misunderstanding around what it is, because often with these terms things get brought in and they then cause confusion because there's some misunderstanding. So what it isn't is being nice. What it isn't is getting your own way. I've taken some of these kind of the top things that people think it is that it isn't from a Harvard Business School article. So if anyone's interested, I can circulate that afterwards. So it's not being nice, it's not getting your own way, it's not a trade-off with performance, and it's not something that you can put a policy in place for. What it is, and this is why it's really important for feedback and therefore client listening, is it is healthy conflict. And it's quite interesting because I think often when I work with teams, there's a nervousness around conflict, there's a nervousness about disagreeing, and actually psychological safety is the ability to be able to be in conflict and to challenge. It's the ability to be heard and to be able to speak up. It's about improving learning behaviours, and it is something that can be modelled. And the reason why I think you mentioned there about leaders and getting buy-in from the top, and the reason why that's important, in fact, yes, I'll share this quickly. So what's interesting about psychological safety, and it ties into some of the things that some of you have picked up on, so Francesca, about this idea of having like different within a firm, you can have different teams where there are different levels of openness or different levels of safety. Amy Edmondson's construct is a team construct, so it is that this team has psychological safety, but there is a debate at the moment around can there be psychological safety if one person doesn't feel safe? And I kind of leave that out there for those that are interested, because it's quite an interesting thought. And it leans into this idea of who has the biggest impact, and the direct leader has the biggest impact. And these things are all things that leaders should be doing if they want to model psychological safety. And they are interesting when we lean back into this idea of what feedback culture do we have in our firm. So these are questions that you can have a look at and I think about. But again, when you think of this idea of how open are we, are these things in play? So do our people show imperfection? Do people demonstrate a growth mindset? I'm going to give a really kind of interesting reflection on that. So growth mindset, there's a really good article by Carol Dweck, who is the person who came up with growth mindset. And those of you who've been on sessions with me before will know, because I mentioned this article before. So Josephine, you're nodding, you might have heard this article before. So we all have a growth mindset and we all have a fixed mindset about different things. And so a growth mindset is where we believe we can learn. A fixed mindset is where we believe it's something that's a natural gift. And I have had a number of coaching sessions with partners in firms, I won't say which firms, where they have said, well, I can't, it's no point me giving feedback to this person because they're not going to learn. And it's quite interesting when you think about the feedback that we might be getting from our client listening programs around how do we approach what we're getting, and do we think people are going to be able to move forward from it? Do our partners show forgiveness? Do they give trust and delegate? Do they have people's backs? These are all things that demonstrate whether or not there is psychological safety. I'm conscious of time and I want to get to the so what, because I'm that's the key bit. So I'm going to skip over the next two slides, but I'm going to share them with you because, again, I want to get you thinking about what sort of culture do we have in our organisations and how do we lean into these things. So in a learning culture where there is high psychological safety and high accountability, people find themselves in the learning zone, i.e. they want to learn, they want to do better, they want to improve. There's this culture of constant innovation. What's interesting when you think about professional services firms is often you find people in the anxiety zone. So there isn't a high degree of psychological safety, but there is a high degree of accountability. So people are responsible for their actions. People are, are expected to do a lot. However, they don't have the safety to challenge. They don't have the safety to question. So the reason why this is important and the reason why this links into culture is because it goes to that bottom layer of what assumptions do we have here and how are we facing and leaning into what we're getting back. Has anyone, maybe you've come across this, I'm going to skip through this because I am mindful of time and I do want to get to the second bit. So Amy Edmondson's new book, I'm not getting any kickback off Amy Edmondson, unfortunately, but if anyone wants to buy her book, it is also very good, and I can recommend it. And she talks about 3 types of wrong. So she talks about basic, complex, and intelligent failures. And basic failures are things where you could have prevented them and they can be foreseeable. So, for example, you get an email and rather than reply to one, you reply to all, that kind of thing. And the way that you can get over those is by training. Complex failures are things that happen in systems which are complex, and they are sometimes predictable, and they are things like when we've got iceberg in my mind, if a boat crashes, it is potentially foreseeable, but it tends to be a combination of different things that go wrong that cause it happening. Intelligent failures, and my question here would be, how many intelligent failures do you see in your organizations? Because the intelligent failures are the ones that point towards open cultures, are failures which are purposeful. So we've actually gone out and sought to fail in order to be able to innovate. And this is when I talk about the difference between innovative, open cultures and open to feedback, because you're constantly trying, you're constantly testing, you're constantly seeing what comes back, are the ones to be encouraged, because they are the ones that show, I guess, in real life that psychological safety exists. I'm going to share these slides and then we'll pause and hopefully we'll have kind of 5-10 minutes for some discussion at the end. So I said, okay, so what? Great. Where have we got to? Where do I want to get to by the end of this session? So hopefully I've got you thinking about culture. Maybe it was something you knew, maybe it was something, I'll send a list of all the kind of recommended reads at the end of the session for those that are interested. Hopefully I've got you thinking about what culture is, and we can think about it from a macro level. And actually, even that example that I gave you about the boat, within our organisations, I know there are a number here that have got global organisations. The cultural context, even big picture, is going to have an impact on those underlying assumptions, particularly when it comes to challenging authority, for example. I've hopefully given you a sense of, okay, there are things that we can see and there are things that we can't see. And in some of your roles, you might be responsible for the things that you can see. You might not necessarily be responsible for the things that you can't see. We can have a discussion about that at the end in terms of what does that mean for your programs and what does that mean for how you approach things. But for me, context is key. And as I said, over and over again, when I'm working with firms, the things that come up over and over again are not about the systems. They're not about, we need to be doing more interviews, we need to be doing this, we need to be doing that. It tends to be more subtle and it tends to be deeper down where the issues arise. So let me come back to this slide. I'm going to show a couple of slides and then circle back, and then we'll have a chat maybe with that slide in the background if people want to kind of jump into some of the questions. So this again is a simple model because I like simple models, and it's Kurt Llewellyn's model of change. For any of you involved in change or have been involved in change programs, you probably will have seen this, and it is not it is, it's kind of the standard model, but it's about the 3 steps that you need to go through if you want to generate cultural change. And the first is that you need to create a motivation to change. And the reason why you need to create a motivating force, a driver for change, is because with any change project, there is an underlying level of fear. And there are two types of fear that arise. One is a fear around learning something new. So there's a status quo bias. People would rather lean into what's there already than move into something that's different. And then there's also a survival anxiety. So what does this mean for me if things change? How is this group going to change if things change in a way that I don't know, in a way that's different? So you need to start to create a motivation for change. You need to start to identify what goals might not be being met. And what you also need to do is you need to start to create awareness around what it is that might need to change. So I'm going to give an example of something that I did with a firm, because I think it's a good example. And it was about feedback in particular. And I did a session and it was with a firm, and it was a firm who actually does quite a lot of stuff. I won't say who they are, but they're quite visible in terms of what they do from a cultural perspective, in terms of, you know, that middle level. They talk a lot about their values and about how they approach things. But this particular team within the firm, so Francesca, going back to there are different teams within different firms, felt that they needed to get better as a firm in giving each other feedback as a group. So I did a session around feedback, and I used Lego Series Play, which other tools are available, but it's one of the tools I use sometimes when I'm doing coaching. And what we did was we tried to think about what does feedback mean for us, and how, and therefore, how can we accommodate what each of us thinks about feedback? And it emerged in the room that one of the partners, for them, feedback really linked back to childhood approval that he sought when he was younger, and he was a bit taken aback by what feedback meant for him and where it had come from. And we ended the session with a realization by everyone that what I need from feedback isn't necessarily what the person next to me needs from feedback. And it really shifted some people's thinking around this is how, you know, I wasn't aware of this, which is a lot of what needs to happen when you talk about cultural change, because it's in the DNA. So it's a lot about I wasn't even aware. So how can you do this? It's about starting to hold up a mirror and starting to challenge. The next stage is to start to learn new models. So to understand, okay, well, what new habits do we need to learn so that we can start to internalize new concepts? So within the context of client listening, because I appreciate it's in an hour, it's quite difficult to go big picture and zoom right down in and concrete. And I'm more than happy, because I'm conscious in an hour I can't go over everything. But hopefully those that know me know that I'm always happy to have a coffee or a virtual or real or a chat. So feel free to pick up the phone to me if you want to carry on the conversation, if you feel like you've not managed to kind of ask the questions that you want and get the answers that you'd like to hear. But when you think about it in the context of client listening, I think often when we think about what needs to change within a program, we go straight to the artifacts. So maybe we need some AI solution. Paul, I think you're still on the line. I'm not dissing AI solutions. They can be very helpful. But, you know, sometimes we jump to, okay, what, you know, maybe we need more budget. Maybe we need to do more interviews. Maybe. And this is quite easy to see, quite easy to vocalize, quite easy to ask for to a degree. However, we might also want to think about and look at, and I'd encourage you, because actually it's a really good way, because most people don't like to have discordance. They want things to be aligned. So I apologise, I've got an Amazon delivery, so if my dog starts barking in the background, that is why. So what you might want to do if you've got a client listening program is to start to look and think about what are the sorts of things that my firm says about clients, about its internal values, about feedback. And that can be quite useful to play back into the business. So for example, if you're looking for budget for client listening, you might say, well, as a firm, we say we are X, Y, and Z. therefore this aligns to that. And if it doesn't align, you know, potentially that's what needs to change, because actually the messaging isn't there. I suspect for all of you, there is some messaging that aligns to that top level, because most firms say they're client-centric, most firms say they're open to feedback, most firms say that they're the trusted advisors to their partners. The next level then is, if I can move forward in the right bit, is underlying. So actually, and you know, I'd encourage, I'm someone who loves to break out of silos and talk to different people. The people to talk to here are your HR teams, your learning and development teams, to think about, well, actually, as a firm, what do we do about feedback? Do we embrace it? Do we action it? Do we hear in our exit interviews that people don't get enough feedback? Do we hear in our exit interviews that feedback hasn't been specific enough? Think about how empowered you are in your teams to challenge. Are you able, often, you know, not often, not always, I guess, you might hear feedback in your client listening programs which is challenging, and for that to be actioned, that needs to be fed back to the partner or partners. Do you have an organization where that's possible, where you can truly go in and say, this is what's arisen, how can, you know, what can we learn, how can we improve, how can we get better? And again, there are things that you can do to start to understand, what am I playing with? Because whilst it takes a long time to change, and part of change is about raising awareness, and it's about, as I said, driving change through motivation, showing why change needs to happen. But actually, for you, understanding, where am I open, am I closed, you know, what do I need to shift, how do I need to shift it, is really the first step. So I'm going to go back, we've got about 5 minutes to this slide. I'm going to rattle through what I put here, because these were sort of some thoughts that I had, and then we've got 5 minutes, so we'll have a bit of a chat, and then I'll kind of do a closing slide. But you know, when you think about, you know, and you might be on this call because you're just interested, which is great. You might be on this call because actually you've got a specific problem with your client listening program, and that's really, you know, kind of hitting here. You know, if you have some barriers, if you have some blocks in your way when you're thinking about your client listening program, what are they, and what might be sitting behind them? You know, might it be something cultural? Might it point to actually that maybe the psychological safety isn't here? Maybe it's because we can't speak up that we might have a problem. I always invite people to observe things as an observer as opposed to someone inside. So what might someone from the outside looking in say? You know, what's working here? What's not working yet? And as I said, think about, how do we approach feedback internally as well as externally, because there's often a link. What do you want to be different? Anyone who's worked with me knows I often ask that question. What do you want to be different at the end? We started talking about behaviours. A lot of a rescue dog who's a right pain when anyone goes to the door. What do you want to be different, and what behaviours do you need to see change? Because often with cultural change, culture drives behaviour, but actually behaviour can then shift culture. So that's why there tends to be a focus on behaviour. So what behaviours might you want to see change? And how might you get people thinking differently about what they can see, but also what they can't see? So that was when I started to think about the so what, the sorts of things I would think about, and the sorts of things that kind of came up for me. But in the 5 minutes left, any questions or thoughts? I'm conscious there's a lot there. And as I said, I'm more than happy to stay on the line after the call, or if anyone wants to kind of a chat with me afterwards, I'm always happy to have a chat. Anyone? Is it something that anyone's thought about before, or something that people think, oh, actually, there's some stuff there that I think might come up?
We're trying to, I'm happy to share. We have launched a program and we struggle a little bit to get people to volunteer their contacts. That's nothing new, really. We're trying to both push and show what it could look like, and when it's good, how it works and the opportunities that we get out of those interviews. But also to push a little bit more from the top. So having our leaders say that this is something they need to do and even work it into KPIs. And I think it's worth doing both in parallel.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think this idea of, you know, and I sort of started there, sometimes the concept of a program is something that is often easier to get buy-in to than, well, actually, but don't speak to, you know, don't speak to this person, don't speak to that person. What and again, for those of you who've been on sessions with me before, I often come back here. What we often try and do is we try and sell the benefit at a firm level, and we forget about the individual level. And actually, often the reasons why people at an individual level don't want to volunteer their clients and don't want to put people forward is because actually, what does that mean for me? And there's two sides to that. What does that mean for me in terms of what I might therefore have to do when I hear what comes back? So actually, I'm gonna, you know, I'm busy already, and now you're going to give me something else to do. And then there's also a connection there with how do individuals receive feedback? How do individuals deal with conflict, which is another thing that's quite interesting that feeds into this whole topic. So often it is, unfortunately, something that, you know, both at firm level but on a one-to-one level needs to be sort of thought about in different ways, where your programs are such that you're at that stage that you need to try and get more people on board. I would say for legal firms in particular, I always, and you will have heard this from me if you've been on a client listening one for me, that, you know, the list of names that go forward for directories should be fair game for client listening programs, because if you've had sign off that those clients can be contacted by a researcher for an interview, which isn't going to be fed back to you, then for me they should absolutely be part of a program for client listening.
Agree.
I agree that the culture is absolutely right, and I think a firm has to be culturally ready in order to have an effective client listening program, because they actually need to evolve their culture through absorbing the client voice. So lots of things around we're client centric, we're this, we're that, the other. But actually, I go back to what I said earlier. It absolutely starts with leadership. Leadership are the only people that can dictate that culture. But also, I think in terms of the sort of conversation with leadership is that it's about, we're not doing client listening for the sake of doing client listening. So what is the commercial benefit to this? Why are we doing it? So we have, I mean, client strategy is very much heart and center of our firm-wide strategy, and it's driven by very serious metrics. And those metrics are driven by a client recommendation rate. And the reason we do that is because if we have so client recommendation is a bit of a psychological thing. I'm sure all of you know this, but if a client will recommend you, that means they're putting their reputation on the line for you. So there's actually quite a lot of psychological loyalty there. And we get instances where we'll get a client recommendation rate that's really quite high, but actually their satisfaction rate is lower because there are some niggles in the relationship, but the relationship is strong enough that they're prepared to air those niggles and deal with them because they don't want to lose the relationship. So, and that, I mean, that's like being married, isn't it? You know, I'd still recommend him. He might drive me bonkers on certain things, but you know, but actually that recommendation is absolutely core to the loyalty and the sentiment of the relationship. But that does absolutely have to come from leadership, and that, you know, we run all our feedback on an opt-out basis. So there's no cherry picking, but we also do it under the principles of fearless feedback, which I'm sure some of you will have heard before. And fearless feedback means that the feedback is always direct, it's honest, it's timely, and it's constructive. And that's really, and again, that's a cultural shift. So that fearless piece is really, really important. That goes back to your psychological safety, Claire, in that, you know, yes, psychological safety is the kind of buzzword for it now, but what people are only frightened of finding out if they think they're going to get bollocked for it. And I'm sorry to be so frank, but that's, you know, if that feedback's going to be used as some kind of stick, then people won't want to hear it because it's easiest to put your head in the sand. But if you work on the basis, as we do, that 99% of the people in our organisation don't want to do a rubbish job. So if something goes wrong, it goes wrong and we can deal with it. And whether that's a training or they're under-resourced or whatever it happens to be, we can deal with it. And having that real continuous improvement, but also commercial objective out of it. So, you know, if we can say, well, and sit at the moment, 90% of our client base would recommend us as a firm of legal advisors, yeah, and actually that's a pretty good place to be. And what it means is that client base is really loyal and they're going to stick with us. So commercially, that's much easier to make profit out of than if we've only got 40% of our client base will recommend us. We've got another 60 who are really twitchy and actually not very loyal. So that's a huge amount of work and effort and money and time and resource put into that. So if you drive this, we can almost, yes, there's some niggles that we need to deal with, but we can park this and actually focus on this bit, which is a much smaller chunk of saying, okay, how do we convert these to the loyal bag so that we have that strong underlying sustainable business that we can grow.
Yeah, and I think a couple of things from just picking up on what you've said there, just to sort of tie it together, and I'm mindful of time, and I know some people have dropped off, and if you have to drop off, then do, but I'll tie it all up and send slides. A couple of things to kind of just to tie it all together there. I mean, you mentioned a few things which for me kind of lean towards, you know, psychological safety, which is this continual improvement point, that actually what can we learn is the key question when you think about psychological safety. And actually that's what it means. It's what can we learn from things that go wrong, and are we able to voice what's gone wrong in order to learn from them. And where you don't have those questions being asked, that's where it's a red flag that you don't have that safety. And I think that the comments that you made around leadership driving it, but it being measured, again, it's just a way, if you think about how do you shift and how do you create change, it's about generating that why and the motivating force. So I think it's a really nice example that actually I hear that quite a lot of this is quite theoretical, but it ties into quite a lot of it. Last thing from me, hopefully, I'm conscious I've given a lot of theory and a lot of talking from me, but hopefully you found it interesting, and hopefully it's got you thinking slightly differently about a topic that I'm sure you all think about a lot already anyway. I never do this because I hate doing the sales piece, but I just wanted to kind of show you how we can help, but also because you can do some of this yourselves. So hopefully that will give you some thinking and thoughts. And I know some of you on the line are part of our Insight community, so I wanted to flag what's available to you. So I guess at the Gather, Reflect, Act, which is the way that we do things and roll around at Client Talk. If you are in the Insight community, then obviously we might already be supporting with client listening. You can also get a BD audit for free, which shows some of these things around motivation, around mindset, around skills training, and we can help with exploring your culture, in terms of reflecting, thinking about how to play the feedback in and exploring feedback more generally. And then at the acting stage, helping around coaching and using the insights, so wrapped into the Insight community. So I know, as I said, some of you online are already in the Insight community, so if you are and you're only using us for one of those bits, don't forget that you can probably be using us for other bits, and some of that there's no charge for. So please, if you're interested, let us know. If there's anything that I've said that's of interest and you want to find out more about, do please get in touch. You've all got my details. I'm always happy to chat, and as I said, either a virtual or a real coffee. Thank you very much for sticking with me for the hour. Apologies for slightly overrunning, but hopefully it was of interest and of use, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks very much, Claire.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks,
Bye.
Claire.
Thanks, Claire. That was really good.
Thank you. Thanks, Paul.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks, Suzanne.
No problem. Bye.